Welcome back, everybody, to Dr. Sellers Educate. We're so happy to continue to support you on your journey towards C&E success. As a reminder, you all know how it goes. If this is not your first time joining us on our YouTube channel, that you first want to go ahead and print out your study worksheet. This study worksheet is going to help guide you every single step of the way as you think about what knowledge gaps you need to close. We do realize that some of you may have already achieved your C&E designation, and we want to give you a round of applause. For those of you that are on the journey to renewal, do know that this information is important for you as well. Being here and showing up every single week when we release a new episode, and you can do that by subscribing, and you'll be notified as soon as the new episode is released. You are going to be able to consider some of the most recent content related to evidence-based teaching strategies and evaluation practices. So even if you're on the journey for renewal and you already have your designation as a certified nurse educator, this information is still very relevant to your work as well. Now, for those of you that are on your journey, you also want to go ahead and pull out Billings and Halstead Teaching and Nursing. Okay, that's going to be what we call our Bible to help guide you every step of the way by looking at primary source information. We don't want you to only listen to the content that we cover on our channel. We want you to also look at our primary textbook to help you further expand your knowledge related to these concepts. So if you have Billings and Halstead pulled out, you can go ahead and turn to page 313. Okay, that's where we're going to start in reviewing our content as we continue on our journey looking at exam analysis A to Z, and we're focusing on judgment and bias for this episode. But before we get started and jumping into our new content, we thought we would do something different for this episode. All right, we know that we have already gone through almost half of the alphabet, so we want to do a little bit of a recap to reflect on where we are right now related to the A to Z journey that we're going on. And we want to do a little bit of reflection. Okay, so part of our reflective practice is to think about what we already know. All right, so we'll get to the will last. So let's start over here looking at A through J. Remember, J is what we're going to cover in this episode. So if you think about A, where we started, and it's almost now been about 6 weeks ago. All right, so A is analysis. If you guessed analysis, you are correct. Remember that you can go back at any given time and review any of the content that we've already covered related to exam analysis, as well as any other episode right here on our YouTube channel. All right, so when we think about analysis, we started by doing just a general overview of some important concepts to help really build that foundation as we're walking through this journey, alphabet by alphabet. So thinking about the test results and the story that the data tells you from your exam analysis report. B, if you guess by serial correlation coefficient, you are correct. Okay, so by looking at by serials, we are able to determine the discrimination, which is the difference between our high scoring students and our low scoring students. All right, and then C, what would you guess C represents? If you guess criterion referencing, then you are correct. Okay, so criterion referencing, also known as our ability to develop evaluation tools that establish a benchmark or a standard that has to be reached in order for the student to master or be proficient or competent with that particular concept. All right, so this is commonly an assessment that is completed when we are developing our competency-based education models. All right, and D stands for difficulty. All right, and this is actually criterion referencing. I don't know how many of you write on a whiteboard, but when you don't write on it as often, you kind of get rusty. So criterion referencing. All right, and then D stands for difficulty. All right, so what you want to do is think about each of these variables or these concepts that we're talking about. How are they measured? So how do they show up in your exam analysis report? Okay, and E, who can tell me what E stood for? If you were thinking E stands for editing, you are correct. So how do we edit our test items, right? To ensure that we are evaluating the learning objectives that we intended those specific exam questions to assess. All right, and then F is all around fairness. All right, so what are those 3 key steps? That's what we talked about. 3 key steps to ensuring that we are developing a fair exam. They include, number 1, clear communication around expectations. We can do that through learning guides. We know that students often ask, well, is there a study guide? Even at the graduate level, I get that question from students. So learning guides really are the best practice to provide information to a student about what they can expect on an exam. Now, not every detail is going to be on a learning guide, but it does give students a good perspective to consider as they develop what their study plan is going to look like and what resources they will need to help them close their knowledge gaps. Step number 2 is providing equal access to resources so students can be best prepared. And then the 3rd step when it comes to fairness that we want to consider is ensuring that our assessment is truly measuring the specific learning objective. All right, so this goes back to mapping. So making sure there's alignment between the content that's included in the course, the actual exam question, you want to think about leveling, and what are the resources or the discussions or interactions that we had to really help students better understand that concept. Okay, so all of those are the variables that we want to consider when we take a look at our exam blueprint and our mapping process. All right, so now we're already up to G. So G, if you guess guidelines and writing effective test questions, you are correct. So G was for guidelines. And then H, if you wrote down or guessed high stakes testing, you are correct. We talked about really 3 different types of high stakes testing and 5 considerations that you want to think about when we are adding high stakes testing to our curriculum. All right, and then that brings us to I, which is item analysis. All right, so we introduced key concepts in our last episode. And then for J, in this episode, we're focusing on judgment. All right. So last reflection we want to do is this diagram that I have drawn, and I'm a very visual learner, and we know that there is usually a combined learning style that most of us have. For me, it definitely is auditory and visual. Okay, so when we think about what we want to focus on related to exam analysis, I encourage you to consider drawing a wheel. Okay, that's what this is supposed to represent. Now, my art isn't the greatest, but you all can understand the concept. So this is a wheel, and we like to call this really our learning wheel. Okay, this is how we really solidify some of the concepts that we're learning about as it relates to exam analysis. All right, and so I'm going to go back. Spelling is one of my strong suits, so I want to make sure I spell that correctly. So this is our learning wheel. All right, so think about our happy, smiling student being in the middle of this learning wheel related to item analysis. And we know every student likes to make A's, right, on exams. So we're going to give this student an A+. All right, and what this represents really is our students' performance, specifically on an exam. What you want to consider is, what are these variables associated and what story do these variables tell me about the student's performance? If I have an A+ student, then I would expect my exam analysis to reflect that, right? So what is it that you're looking at? You want to consider data or concepts such as, what is the reliability? Okay, so what is the data telling me about my students' knowledge level and comprehension? All right, so reliability. And the next concept you want to consider could be validity. All right, so validity could be the next one. And another one you want to consider is discrimination. So how is my A+ student performing on an exam? How is it discriminating this specific student's performance compared to a student that is not performing as well on exams? And then validity. So what validity data am I learning about my student when it comes to the exam? So this is all centered around not only the quantitative story, because that's really important when we think about exam analysis. You want to be clear about these concepts that we've been talking about, but what is the qualitative story as well? And how do we make sure that we are not including biases and being mindful of any biases that we may have? All right, so that was just a little bit of a reflection of how far we've come, minus the fancy artwork. Hopefully you were able to grasp some of those concepts that we've already covered. And if it's a muddy area for you, I just want you to take some time to write down whatever concept you weren't quite connecting with me about, and go back and watch the episode that's relevant for you. You know, that's the great thing about the episodes that we publish here every single week. You can go back at any given time and look at them in case you need a refresher or really just want to clear up any muddy points that you may have. All right, so now let's go ahead and take a look at content starting on page 313 in Billings and Halstead. You're going to see gender and linguistic bias. We're going to talk about some key concepts when we talk about bias. There are actually 4 different types of bias that is covered in Billings and Halstead. And you may wonder, okay, how much of this do I need to know? When it comes to the C&E exam, we would encourage you to become very familiar with all of the key terms that we're going to be talking about in this episode. All right, so let's get started by taking a look at some of those key elements when we talk about exam analysis that are directly tied to or influenced by biases. All right, so let's talk about 3 important steps. First, you want to consider, are the questions clearly written? Second, are the answer options accurate? So having a second set of eyes, having a few nurse educator colleagues take a look at the exam questions and options to make sure the questions are clearly written, and number 2, that the answer options are accurate. We should, just like we map our content that we review right here in any of our programs, but especially here with our episodes, we want to make sure that it's mapped back to content so you can go back, take some time to reflect, and ensure that you're closing your knowledge gaps with the primary resources that we refer you to during our episode. And number 3, that grading rubrics are fair. Now, we know fair can sometimes be a gray term, but you want to make sure that you are leaning on your nurse educator colleagues to give you feedback and to consider some of the concepts that we're talking about as we further explore what bias is really all about and what those 4 types are. If you take a look on page 482, you're going to see some really good strategies that will help you decrease your bias. Okay, so there are 4 types of biases that Bosher talks about on page 482, and strategies to avoid potential bias in test items. Those 4 types or categories include test-wise flaws, irrelevant difficulty, linguistic bias, and cultural bias. All right, so let's take a look at our thought-provoking question. We have a nurse educator that is attempting to avoid potential bias when writing test items. So which approach would best eliminate linguistic bias? A, writing at the level of reading comprehension for the test taker. B, using the present tense and passive voice to connect with the test taker. C, reduce the reading load by using simple words and relevant content. Or D, writing clear stems and using gender when writing case studies. All right, you can always pause this episode and come back when you're ready. Now we're going to do a further dive into some concepts and really terms that you want to think about when you are on a journey to decrease your bias. I encourage you to go back and look at your exams with a colleague. You know, this is a great opportunity for you to share something that you've learned right here on our channel with your colleagues. Go back and take a look at your exams. Determine if there are biases, and if there are, this is a great time for you to step back, make those changes, and then see how students perform based on the changes that you made. Or you may even hear feedback directly from students. So let's talk about the exam results. First of all, we want to increase our awareness of our biases, and we're going to talk about some of those key steps that you can take as well as assumptions. We want to consider the story that the data is telling us. Remember, going back to my A+ student and the wheel, you want to consider whether or not there's more to the story. We know there always is. However, we want to be mindful that we are taking in consideration the quantitative data, right, based on this exam analysis report, And consider feedback during the exam review, or perhaps even during a course evaluation or during a future discussion. There may be some aha moments that we would have based on feedback that our students are telling us in a more qualitative way. And then the third consideration is making sure that we're using evidence-based reasoning. And I would say going back to our textbooks, going back to the primary resources to validate that our answers are indeed correct, okay? Because sometimes we do see what we want to see instead of what's actually there. I know many of us have found that to be the case, so we just want to be mindful of that. Some key observations that you want to think about is to, first of all, analyze the exam results. Were there strengths and weaknesses? Are there opportunities to improve the exam questions because of bias? And it could be based on feedback that we hear from our students. Again, it goes back to developing that solid faculty-student relationship that's professional, but also where students feel like they can speak up in a professional way, and we're able to take that feedback and make changes to improve the learning experiences that our students have, but also to help our evaluations be more valid and reliable. And then second is to avoid judgment bias by remaining objective and fair in our analysis. Now, I know that can be tough, but the more objective we could be and stay away from that subjectivity, the less likely we are to invoke these judgment biases that we're talking about. So how is bias defined? It is a tendency to lean in favor of or against a person, group, idea, or thing, usually in a way that is unfair. In order for us to decrease those biases, we want to ask our colleagues, ask them for open, very transparent feedback, and then to really encourage our colleagues to challenge any assumptions that they hear about. I love this picture, by the way. It just shows the importance of us all collaborating and working together. Even though there are differences among us, we want to be able to work together to decrease the bias, because that's only going to improve our ability to validate that learning has happened with our students. All right, so let's take a look at our thought-provoking question. If you chose C, you are correct. The correct answer is reduce the reading load by using simple words and relevant content, and that is on page 482. That is the best strategy that is going to help eliminate linguistic bias. All right, so let's take a look at the definition on page 482. Again, we see 4 different types of biases, specifically looking at the third paragraph under avoiding potential bias in test items. We see that linguistic modification could include writing short and clearly understood questions, and we can reduce it by the reading load of test items by eliminating irrelevant information, using simple words, and using short sentences. Faculty should also avoid using slang or idioms when it comes to developing questions. All right, so if you were curious as to why the other choices were not correct, all right, so A, that is a distractor that we added because this has nothing to do with bias. This is the definition of readability of test items, which we should always consider, but it's not related to linguistic bias or any type of bias. Option B is incorrect because we have passive voice and it should be used in present tense and active voice. And then for D, we want our stems and our questions to be gender neutral, right? We don't want to include gender when we're writing our case study. So in conclusion, in order for us to avoid these judgment biases, we want to first do a self-assessment, right? We want to increase our awareness of what our individual biases are. When you take a look at page 313, it talks about some different tools that we encourage you to consider. One of them includes a self-awareness on personal biases that was developed by Harvard's Project Implicit Bias Tool. So on page 313 is where you will find that actual hyperlink to the tool. And then looking at Claudia Steele's work, and listen to this fact, we thought this was interesting. Her work his work indicated that even the fear that one will be judged according to specific stereotypes can depress academic performance. So just think about that. Now, we know that we can't change students' mindset, but what we can do is create a judgment-free zone and work in an effort to decrease our judgment biases with our students so that we decrease the likelihood of them feeling that way, or at least us doing everything we can to decrease the likelihood that they will feel that way. So just think about that statement. That's pretty profound to think that even students walking in a room, having that mindset, feeling that way can directly affect their performance, their academic performance. All right. So the resource again is going to be page 313 in Billings and Halstead. And then the secondary resource that talks a lot specifically about developing those exams that will decrease biases is on page 482. As always, we hope that this information has been helpful for you. And until next time, you can reach out to us and we will see you in our next episode. Have a great one, everybody. Bye-bye.